answering the app privacy questions for the app privacy labels. So this is a new requirement that Apple added last year, and it requires you to answer some questions before you can submit your app. And all these questions are about privacy and how you use user data. And once you submit those answers, they then show up on your app's product page, and that looks like this. And you get a few different sections at the bottom that list data in sections by what's used for tracking, what's linked, and what's collected. And the reason that Apple has added this requirement is that every year apps are adding more and more user data to what they collect, and especially the SDKs that developers are integrating into their apps, they all are collecting more and more data. And it actually turns out that users of software have legal rights to control what data is collected and who that data is shared with. And so depending on the jurisdiction, there's going to be different laws. There's a European law, GDPR, there's some in California, there's some newer laws, and then there's some older laws that go back to the 90s and older that cover collection of user data and sharing of that. And so Apple has decided, this is what they're going to do. They're going to ask they're going to ask developers to share this information, and then they're going to give it to the users before they download the app. And in addition to that, they've also started analyzing your binary. So if you're using some of the more popular SDKs and you're not correctly disclosing the types of data that you're using that those SDKs use, then they do email you and tell you that you need to update your answers, and they might even reject your updates in the future if you don't. And so they're not doing this for everything, but there's a few SDKs that people have reported that they get an email because they didn't correctly answer the questions. And then also, I saw that Congress sent a letter to Tim Cook telling him that Congress would like to know more about how this information is audited and whether consumers can truly trust the answers that they read there on the product pages. So yeah, this is important, and it's going to be probably more and more important in the future as it gets more detailed, and there's probably going to be more audits of what data that you collect. So yeah, it's important that you give the correct answers, and to give the correct answers, you first need to understand what data do you collect. And so according to Apple, this is their definition for collecting data. It's transmitting data off of the device and keeping it beyond what's required to service requests in real time. So that means if you have user data that never actually gets transmitted off the device, if you're just collecting it, if the user's entering it and it's just saved in the app on their phone and never leaves the phone, then that doesn't count as collecting the data. And then also, if the user is using the app and it's sending a request to your server with their data, but then as soon as you finish serving the request, you don't save that data, you're also not collecting the data. So for example, if you have an app that shows you nearby restaurants, and the app sends a request saying, give me nearby restaurants to this longitude and latitude, but then after you look up the restaurants, you return them the restaurants, and you don't actually save the location that was sent, then you aren't, according to this definition, not collecting data. And then, so what type of data do you collect? So there's 3 different questions that you need to understand when you're trying to figure out what data you collect. The first is the types of user data. So there's different types. Then there's the purpose of the data use. So there's different purposes for how you use data. And then there's the issue of whether you're linking the data to specific people or whether you're using the data to track people across different apps. So for that first one, what are the types of data? Apple has a list of what they think are all the different types of user data. So here's a little screenshot of part of that page, but it's on developer.apple.com/appstore/app privacy details. And there's a section called types of data. And so you can read through that. But so kind of what you need to do when you're getting ready to answer those questions is you need to make your own list of which of these types of data you collect. And because only data that leaves the app counts as collecting, you can just go through and make a list of all your URL session requests. And for most apps, it's not going to be that many, maybe a few dozen. And so for each one of those, you can see, you can look at which of these types of data you are sending. And then on the server side, you can see whether you're actually saving that data or if it's um, if it's discarded once the request completes.
What about for like a third-party ad
Yeah,
service?
yeah, I'll get that. I'll get to that. So this is just this is just for your own. This is just starting off with how what type of data do you collect in your own code. So then the second part of that question is the types of use of data use. So this is so for each of the user data that you collect, there's going to be different purposes of why you're collecting it. So one is third-party advertising. There's developer advertising or marketing. There's analytics. There's product personalization. There's app functionality, and then there's other purposes. And so again, this is on that same page on the developer website, and they give definitions of each one of these types. But so for each one of those data types that you're collecting, you just need to look at these purposes and kind of check all that apply for that data. And then further into this question of how do you use the data, there's the concept of linking to a user. So if you have some kind of unique identifier for each person, and then you're tying the user data to that identifier, then you're linking it to the user. But if you're just getting, for example, analytics about users with no unique identifier for each user, that would still be useful for you. But that's still collecting data, but it's not linking to the user if there's no unique identifier or email address or name or anything tied to the individual data points. And then there's the question of whether you're using the data to track the user across apps. And for that, they've got a definition too. So tracking is sharing data with a third party or using shared data from a third party for targeted advertising or advertising performance tracking. So it's somehow tracking user always has to do with advertising. So either you're sharing the data with a broker so that they can use it for showing advertising in another app or on a website, or you're using it to show ads in your own app, or there was an ad somewhere and someone clicked on it and they're in your app now and you're tracking that they came from that ad. All those things are tracking. But if you're not doing anything with advertising and you're not sharing data with someone that's using it for advertising, you're not tracking the user. So that's those concepts. And then so the question of third-party SDKs. So here you need to take a different approach because you can't look at the code of the SDK. But fortunately, a lot of these SDKs have been updating their documentation, so you can look in there and they'll actually list out what user data they're collecting. But if they don't have that explicitly listed, then it's also a good idea to look in the privacy policy of the SDK and see if they have any data collection disclosures in there. And then also, a lot of the SDKs, they have some type of GDPR notice or CCPA notice, and that's the European and the California privacy law, and so they've got like a specific disclosure saying, this is us complying with that law, and that will usually have some data collection disclosures in there as well, so you can look through that and see. And so with that, hopefully you can get a list of all of the user data that the SDK is collecting. But then if you want to be really thorough, you can also actually look at the traffic between your app and the SDK's server. And there's this app on iOS called Charles Proxy. And with that app, you can see all the requests, which server it's hitting, what the body of the request is, the headers and everything. And so with that, you could potentially figure out some more some more user data that an SDK could be sending.
Is Fiddler on Mac as well?
I haven't heard of that.
It's Charles is better than
Yeah, so Charles Proxy also, they have a Mac app, but the iOS app is super simple. You just you just buy the app on the App Store, and then you have to basically give it access like it's a VPN to your traffic, and then what you turn it on individually for each server that it connects to, and then you just use the app like normal, and it routes all of your traffic through the app before it goes to the server.
I wonder if we could Wireshark and Wireshark actually works, yeah.
And then, so at this point now, you'll know all your user data that you're collecting. You'll know whether you're using it for tracking. You'll know what your uses are. You'll know about the third-party SDKs. So at that point, you have a really good idea of all the data you're collecting. One thing to note is that there's also certain data collection that Apple does of your users, but they kind of see them as their users. So, for example, the crash reports that show up in Xcode, those are user data, but because they're collected by Apple, you don't have to disclose them in your your app privacy question. And then also the App Store analytics that show you how many active users you have and other things like that. Those are all going through Apple, and Apple manages people's consent because when they update their iOS or install it, it already asks them whether they want to share this data with you, and they have a way in settings to manage which developers they share data with. So you don't have to disclose any of those in your answers to your app privacy questions. So at that point, then you've got all your answers, so you can go through in App Store Connect, and you get this form that you can go through and just answer all the questions that they get, and then that will generate for you your little disclosures that shows up on your product page. So these privacy labels are kind of like nutrition labels. I'm sure whenever nutrition labels started becoming a requirement, the manufacturers of different stuff, they were probably unhappy about this requirement. But at the end of the day, it's really a good thing for the consumers, and it also allows the companies and developers that are doing better to be able to show that and be able to differentiate themselves because they're fairly and honestly disclosing how they use user data in their apps.